Hello, everyone. This is my brief review for time periods 3 through 8 for our chronology test on Thursday. So let's begin. Time period 3 is from 1754 until 1800. And we begin in 1754 because that is the start of the French and Indian War. This is a war between the French and almost all of the Native Americans against the British and the colonists. The only Native American group who sided with the British and the colonists, to the best of my knowledge, were the Iroquois. Though the French and Indian War is considered a turning point in the relationship between the British and the colonists. I should point out that in Europe, this was called the Seven Years' War, and it started in 1756. But before the war, the British and the colonists were on the same side. At the end of the war, the colonists now are expected to pay for the cost of the war, and this leads to all of the causes of the American Revolution from 1763 until 1775. And at the end of that time period is the first shot heard around the world, Battle of Lexington and Concord. So the actual fighting between the British and the colonists took place 1 year prior to the Declaration of Independence. I probably should have put Thomas Paine's Common Sense on the timeline, but this is just the beginning, so it's okay. And the Declaration is a list of all the grievances that the colonists had against the king. Then, after the Declaration of Independence, will be the American Revolutionary War from 1776 to 1783. Once the war is completed, the Americans formed their first government, which was called the Articles of Confederation. This was a very weak central government. Most of the power resided with the states, and it did not succeed. So it was replaced by the Constitution. And it took us a few years to iron out all the details of our guiding document that we still have today. And then following the Constitution, we refer to this as the early republic. That'll be the presidency of Washington and Adams. And it does include one of your personal favorites, for some of you, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who you will be learning about very shortly. Time period 4, from 1800 to 1848, begins with the election of Thomas Jefferson. And one of his most significant achievements is the Louisiana Purchase. After Jefferson will be President Madison, and he will get us involved in the War of 1812, which is sometimes called the Second American Revolution, because we fought the British for a second time. Following the War of 1812 will be a short period called the Era of Good Feelings. This is when there was only one political party, this known as the Democratic Republicans. And that ended with a very controversial presidential election between four candidates in 1824 called the Corrupt Bargain. You have no idea the restraint that I am showing by not just talking about everything. I really am making this the brief overview. The Corrupt Bargain angers Andrew Jackson, and he will win the next election, 1828, but we refer to this time period as the Age of Jackson. And the end of this time period is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. One more topic I could have included in this time period was that we were expanding westward. Okay, time period 5, 1844 to 1877, begins with a very underrated president, James K. Polk, who only served one term and fulfilled almost all, if not all, of his promises. From 1820 to 1860, and I began in 1820, apologize for that, but that's the Missouri Compromise. This is known as the antebellum period. You could also just refer to it as causes of the Civil War. Antebellum means before the war, so this is all of the events leading up to our Civil War. The election of Lincoln in 1860 is really what triggered the secession of the Southern states. The Civil War is 1861 to 1865. And then following the Civil War, we have to rebuild as a country. We have to reunite. We have to figure out the policies for that. We also have to deal with the roughly 2 million, 4 million maybe, 4 million newly freed slaves who are going to eventually become citizens. This is all during the Reconstruction era. Again, I'm showing remarkable restraint. Okay, time period 6 is the late 1800s. Mark Twain, the author, called it the Gilded Age. He used this term to describe what he perceived to be an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. So anything during the late 1800s time frame will deal with industrialization, People are moving to the cities, urbanization. There's an increase in immigration to the country. People like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan will be these big businessmen. Some of them formed monopolies, which is during this time period. Workers felt as if they were being mistreated, so they created labor unions. The general principle of the government was laissez-faire, hands-off, limited involvement, very little regulation. We also see a lot of inventions during this time period, Alexander Graham Bell being one of them. And then most of that is in the northeastern part of the country. We also will see settlement of the West. The Homestead Act gives people free land out west. And then in the South, they are dealing with Jim Crow laws, segregation that will be legal in this country until 1954. All right, now we go to time period 7, and the problems of the Gilded Age started to get exposed by writers like muckrakers who sparked this progressive era. So the progressive movement is following the Gilded Age. Most people seem to think that the Gilded Age is when the government stayed out of affairs, and the progressive era, sparked by Teddy Roosevelt, led to more government involvement. But just be aware there are some historians who think we should really combine both time periods and argue that this was when we were debating the role of government. Although, as one student said, haven't we always been doing that? And she was correct. All right, then we go to imperialism. The age of imperialism is 1867 to 1914. I started in 1867 because that is the date of the purchase of Alaska. So this is when America is becoming more of a force in world affairs. I'm realizing that I did not include the Spanish-American War on this timeline, which I'm going to try to do it without messing up the video. But the Spanish-American War is in 1898 and 1899. That is really another turning point war. This is when the United States emerges as a world power. And now, of course, I'm wondering, did I even go over the Mexican-American War earlier, or did I skip that? I think I may have. But the Mexican-American War, 1846, 1848, is when we acquired California and the rest of the Mexican cession. But now I'm messing this video up, but we're going to continue with it anyway. All right. World War I is 1914 to 1919, following this age of imperialism. And then we will enter a more conservative economic time, the Roaring Twenties, which ends on October 29th, 1929, which is the stock market crash. That leads to the Great Depression of 1929 to 1941. And some people think that it is World War II that got us out of the Depression. I put 1939 because that is the date that Germany invaded Poland. But we do not get involved until the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. And then we will wrap this up with time period 8. As we talked about in class, there are a few different ways you could teach this. Some people may just do it decade by decade, but I like to break it up into themes. So you have foreign affairs first. We are mostly impacted by the Cold War during this time period. And the Cold War, you'll see proxy wars in Korea. So the Korean War is 1950 to 1953. We have conflicts with the Soviet Union over our presence in Cuba and the Soviet presence in Cuba. So we tried to overthrow Fidel Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union in 1962. The Vietnam War is 1964 to 1973. And then the symbolic end is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. But then you have domestic affairs, so we could focus just on the civil rights movement from beginning to end. We could talk about the second wave of feminism as well. And just be aware that the 50s is a more conservative time period, and the 60s is a more liberal era, and the 70s is really defined by our economic troubles, the oil crisis, and the Watergate scandal with Nixon. Okay, so certainly not my best work, but I just need to make sure we get it covered. So you have this as an option to study from. You have the time frame on the Google Classroom site, and I'm sure everybody's going to do well. But if not, reach out to me and ask. Please, if you feel like you're struggling with this tremendously and you have made an effort, speak to me and we will work something out. Have a great day, and I will see you the next time I see you.